In the shadowed corridors of Ravensholm Castle, where centuries of royal blood have both blessed and cursed the throne, a single cup of tea would shatter the very foundation of a kingdom. What happens when the person you trust most becomes the architect of your destruction? When love transforms into the deadliest weapon of all? Palace guard Marcus Sterling thought he had seen everything in his 15 years of service to the crown. Political assassinations, foreign spy attempts, even family feuds that turned violent. But nothing could have prepared him for the moment he would witness Queen Helena, beloved by the people, cherished by her husband, carefully measuring drops of liquid death into King Edmund's evening beverage. In a world where faith in family is everything, sometimes the most toxic poison isn't found in a bottle, it's found in the heart of those closest to us. This is the story of how one man's loyalty to his king would force him to choose between protecting a crown and destroying a queen, and how a kingdom's greatest love story became its most devastating nightmare. The truth, once revealed, would prove that sometimes the most dangerous enemies don't storm the castle gates, they serve you tea with a smile. The ancient stones of Ravensholm Castle had witnessed many secrets, but none quite like the one that would unfold on that crisp autumn evening in 1823. The fortress stood majestically against the darkening sky, its towers piercing the clouds like accusations pointed toward heaven. Within its walls, King Edmund Blackthorn ruled the kingdom of Valdoria with a gentle hand, beloved by his people and utterly devoted to his wife of 12 years, Queen Helena. Marcus Sterling adjusted his Royal Guard uniform as he made his evening rounds through the castle's east wing. At 35, he had served the crown longer than any other guard in the palace, earning the trust and respect of both the royal family and his fellow soldiers. His weathered face bore the scars of countless battles fought in service to the kingdom, and his steel-grey eyes had learned to see danger in the smallest details. Tonight, those same eyes would witness something that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The castle bustled with its usual evening activities. Servants hurried through the corridors carrying silver trays laden with the finest delicacies, their soft footsteps echoing against the marble floors. Candles flickered in their ornate holders, casting dancing shadows that seemed to whisper secrets of their own. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and burning oak from the massive fireplaces that warmed the royal chambers. King Edmund sat in his private study, surrounded by leather-bound books and maps of distant lands. At 43, he remained a handsome man, with kind brown eyes and salt and pepper hair that gave him a distinguished appearance. His subjects often remarked that he possessed the rare combination of strength and compassion that made for a truly great ruler. He had spent the day mediating a dispute between neighboring provinces, and the weight of leadership showed in the slight furrow of his brow as he reviewed the documents spread before him. The king's relationship with Queen Helena had become the stuff of legends throughout Valdoria. Their love story was one that poets sang about and young couples aspired to emulate. Helena had arrived at court as a foreign princess, sent to marry Edmund as part of a political alliance between their kingdoms. What had begun as a diplomatic arrangement had blossomed into a deep and passionate love that seemed to grow stronger with each passing year. Queen Helena moved through the castle with the grace of a woman born to royalty. At 38, she possessed an ethereal beauty that had only intensified with age. Her raven-black hair was always perfectly arranged, and her violet eyes seemed to hold depths of mystery that captivated everyone who looked into them. She wore her crown not as a burden, but as a natural extension of her being. The people of Valdoria adored her for her charitable works and her unwavering support of the king. Marcus had always admired the royal couple's devotion to each other. In a world where royal marriages were often cold political arrangements, Edmund and Helena had found something rare and precious. They were frequently seen walking hand in hand through the castle gardens, laughing together over private jokes and supporting each other through the challenges of ruling a kingdom. Their love had produced two beautiful children, Prince Alexander, aged 10, and Princess Isabella, aged 8, both of whom were the pride and joy of the entire kingdom. As Marcus continued his rounds, he noticed the subtle changes in the castle's atmosphere that had begun to emerge over the past few months. There were whispered conversations that stopped when he approached, worried glances exchanged between senior staff members, and an underlying tension that seemed to permeate the very air they breathed. The king had been experiencing periodic bouts of illness that left him weak and confused, symptoms that the royal physicians struggled to explain. Dr. Whitmore, the castle's chief physician, had been summoned countless times over the past 6 months to attend to the king's mysterious ailments. The symptoms were puzzling. Severe stomach pains, dizziness, temporary loss of memory, and a general weakness that came and went without warning. The doctor had prescribed various treatments and dietary changes, but nothing seemed to provide lasting relief. The queen had been by her husband's side through every episode, nursing him with the devotion of a loving wife. She personally oversaw his meals, prepared his evening tea with her own hands, and rarely left his bedside when he was unwell. The court had praised her dedication, and Marcus himself had been moved by her apparent concern for the king's well-being. On this particular evening, Marcus was making his way toward the royal chambers when he heard the soft clink of china from the queen's private sitting room. The door stood slightly ajar, and through the narrow gap, he could see Queen Helena preparing the king's evening tea. This was her nightly ritual, one that had touched the hearts of everyone in the castle. She would personally brew his favorite blend of Earl Grey, add just the right amount of honey, and serve it to him in his study as he completed his daily correspondence. Marcus paused in the hallway, not wanting to interrupt what he knew to be a sacred moment between husband and wife, but something in the queen's movements caught his attention. Instead of her usual graceful, unhurried preparation of the tea, there was something furtive and deliberate about her actions. She glanced toward the door several times, and her hands moved with a precision that seemed almost calculated. From his position in the hallway, Marcus watched as Queen Helena reached into a small wooden box that sat on her dressing table. The box was ornate, carved with intricate patterns that he had never seen before, and it was clear that it held something of great importance to her. She extracted a tiny glass vial filled with a clear liquid that caught the candlelight and seemed to shimmer with an almost otherworldly quality. The guard's breath caught in his throat as he watched the queen carefully measure several drops of the mysterious liquid into the king's teacup. She held the vial with the steady hand of someone who had performed this action many times before, counting each drop with mathematical precision. The liquid disappeared into the tea without leaving any visible trace, and Helena stirred the mixture with a silver spoon, her face a mask of concentration. Marcus felt his world tilt on its axis as the implications of what he was witnessing crashed over him like a cold wave. The woman he had sworn to protect, the queen who was beloved by an entire kingdom, was deliberately poisoning her own husband. The loving wife who had earned praise for her devotion was systematically destroying the man she had vowed to cherish and protect. The guard's mind raced as he tried to process what he had seen. Every instinct screamed at him to burst through the door and confront the queen, to grab the poisoned tea and demand an explanation. But years of military training had taught him the value of patience and careful observation. If he was wrong, if there was some innocent explanation for what he had witnessed, his accusations could destroy not only his own career, but potentially destabilize the entire kingdom.
Queen Helena completed her preparation of the tea and placed it on a silver tray alongside some small cakes and biscuits.
She smoothed her dress, checked her reflection in the mirror, and transformed her face into the loving expression that the king had come to expect from his devoted wife. The change was so complete, so perfectly executed, that Marcus began to doubt his own eyes. Could the woman who now looked like the picture of wifely devotion really be capable of such calculated evil? As Helena lifted the tray and moved toward the door, Marcus quickly stepped back into the shadows of an alcove, pressing himself against the cold stone wall. His heart hammered in his chest as the queen passed within inches of his hiding place. The poisoned tea balanced delicately in her hands. The sweet scent of Earl Grey mixed with honey drifted past him, a smell that would forever be associated in his mind with betrayal and deceit. Marcus followed at a safe distance as Queen Helena made her way through the castle corridors toward the king's study. She moved with her usual elegant grace, nodding pleasantly to the servant she encountered and exchanging brief words of greeting with other members of the court. To anyone watching, she appeared to be nothing more than a loving wife bringing her husband his evening refreshment. The study door was open when they arrived, and Marcus could see King Edmund sitting at his massive oak desk, quill pen in hand as he worked on what appeared to be a letter to one of his provincial governors. The warm light from the fireplace cast a golden glow over the room, creating an atmosphere of comfort and security that would soon be shattered by the poison Helena carried on her silver tray. "My darling." Helena's voice was warm and musical as she entered the study. "I've brought your tea." King Edmund looked up from his correspondence with a smile that lit up his entire face. The love and trust in his eyes were so evident that Marcus felt physically sick watching from his concealed position in the hallway. This was a man who had no idea that the woman he adored was slowly killing him, who welcomed each poisoned cup of tea as a gesture of love rather than an act of murder. "You spoil me, my dear," Edmund said, rising from his chair to kiss his wife's cheek. "I don't know what I would do without your care." Helena's laugh was light and melodious as she set the tray down on a small table near the fireplace. "Nonsense. It's my pleasure to take care of you. You work so hard for the kingdom. The least I can do is ensure you have a proper cup of tea to end your day." Marcus watched in horror as the king lifted the poisoned teacup to his lips and took a long, appreciative sip. Edmund's face showed nothing but contentment as he savored the warm beverage, completely unaware that each swallow was bringing him closer to a slow and painful death. Helena watched her husband drink with an expression of tender concern, but Marcus could now see something cold and calculating in her violet eyes that had been invisible to him before. The conversation between the royal couple continued for several minutes, filled with the kind of intimate details that had made their relationship the envy of courts throughout Europe. They discussed their children's education, plans for the upcoming harvest festival, and Edmund's concerns about a potential trade dispute with a neighboring kingdom. Throughout it all, Helena encouraged her husband to finish his tea, gently reminding him that it would help him sleep better. As Marcus continued to watch from the shadows, he began to notice other details that had previously escaped his attention. Helena's hand rested on a small leather journal that she carried everywhere, a book that he had always assumed contained poetry or personal thoughts. Now he wondered if it might contain something far more sinister. Records of dosages, observations of symptoms, or plans for the king's gradual demise. The realization struck him that Queen Helena was not acting impulsively or in a moment of madness. This was a carefully orchestrated plan that had been months, perhaps even years, in the making. The king's mysterious illnesses suddenly made perfect sense, as did the gradual progression of symptoms that had baffled the royal physicians. Helena had been slowly poisoning her husband, using doses small enough to avoid immediate detection, but large enough to cause cumulative damage over time. King Edmund finished his tea and set the empty cup back on the tray with a satisfied sigh. Almost immediately, Marcus could see the subtle changes beginning to take effect. The king's face grew slightly pale, and he pressed his hand to his stomach with a grimace of discomfort. These were the same symptoms that had been plaguing him for months, the mysterious ailments that had worried the entire court. "Are you feeling unwell again, my love?" Helena asked, her voice filled with what sounded like genuine concern. "Perhaps you should retire early tonight." "I'll have Dr. Whitmore come to check on you if the pain gets worse." Edmund nodded weakly, already beginning to feel the familiar weakness that had become such a troubling part of his life. "I think that might be wise. This stomach trouble seems to come and go without warning." Helena helped her husband to his feet, supporting him with what appeared to be loving care as they made their way toward the royal bedchamber. Marcus followed at a distance, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had discovered. The woman who was now tenderly helping the king to bed was the same person who had deliberately caused his suffering. Once the royal couple had retired for the evening, Marcus made his way back to his own quarters, his thoughts in turmoil. He sat on the edge of his narrow bed, staring at the stone walls of his small room as he tried to decide what to do with the terrible knowledge he now possessed. The weight of his discovery felt crushing, as if the very walls of the castle were pressing down on him. The implications of Queen Helena's actions were staggering. If she was indeed poisoning the king, then she was not only committing murder, but also threatening the stability of the entire kingdom. Edmund's death would leave young Prince Alexander as heir to the throne, with Helena serving as regent until he came of age. Such a scenario would give the queen unprecedented power over Valdoria, power that she was apparently willing to kill for. Marcus thought about the children, innocent Prince Alexander and Princess Isabella, who adored their mother and had no idea of the evil that lurked beneath her loving facade. If Helena was capable of murdering their father, what might she do to them if they ever stood in the way of her ambitions? The guard felt a cold chill run down his spine as he considered the possibility that the entire royal family might be in danger. As the night wore on, Marcus found himself unable to sleep. He paced his small room like a caged animal, torn between his duty to protect the king and his uncertainty about how to proceed. If he made accusations without sufficient proof, he could be executed for treason. But if he remained silent and the king died, he would be complicit in murder. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside his room caused Marcus to freeze. It was well past midnight, and most of the castle's inhabitants should have been asleep. He pressed his ear to the door and heard the soft whisper of silk skirts moving past his room. Someone was walking through the castle in the dead of night, moving with the careful stealth of someone who did not want to be discovered. Marcus waited several minutes before carefully opening his door and peering out into the dimly lit corridor. The hallway appeared empty, but he could just make out the faint sound of footsteps disappearing around the corner that led to the castle's lower levels. His curiosity piqued. He decided to follow, moving as silently as his heavy boots would allow on the stone floors. The trail led him down a series of increasingly narrow staircases, past storage rooms and servants' quarters to parts of the castle that were rarely visited by members of the court. The air grew colder and more musty as he descended, and the dancing shadows cast by his single candle seemed to take on ominous shapes in the darkness. Finally, Marcus heard voices coming from behind a heavy wooden door that he recognized as the entrance to the castle's wine cellar. The voices were too quiet for him to make out individual words, but he could tell that at least two people were engaged in serious conversation. One of the voices was definitely female, with the refined accent that he had come to associate with nobility. Marcus pressed his ear to the door and strained to hear what was being said. The conversation was still too muffled to understand clearly, but he caught fragments of words that sent chills down his spine. Dosage, timing, inheritance, and throne. It was becoming increasingly clear that Queen Helena was not acting alone in her murderous scheme. The meeting in the wine cellar lasted for nearly an hour, during which Marcus remained frozen in place, afraid to move lest he make a sound that would reveal his presence. When the voices finally ceased, he heard footsteps approaching the door and barely had time to hide behind a large stone pillar before the door swung open. Queen Helena emerged from the cellar, followed by a man that Marcus recognized as Sir Roderick Blackwood, one of the king's most trusted advisors. The sight of the queen's confidant participating in what was clearly a conspiracy added another layer of horror to Marcus's discovery. If Sir Roderick was involved, then the plot against the king might extend far deeper into the court than he had imagined. Helena and Sir Roderick parted ways at the bottom of the stairs, with the queen returning to the upper levels of the castle, while the advisor disappeared into the shadows of the lower corridors. Marcus waited until both conspirators were well out of sight before emerging from his hiding place, his mind racing with this new information. Sir Roderick Blackwood was a man of considerable influence within the kingdom, someone who had served King Edmund's father before him, and who was widely respected for his political acumen. His involvement in the plot suggested that there might be powerful forces working against the king, possibly including other members of the nobility who would benefit from Edmund's death and Helena's regency. As Marcus made his way back to his quarters, he realized that he was no longer dealing with a simple case of spousal murder. This was a complex conspiracy that threatened not only the king's life, but the very foundation of the kingdom itself. The weight of his knowledge seemed to grow heavier with each step, and he found himself wondering if he was strong enough to bear the burden of stopping such a far-reaching plot. The first light of dawn was beginning to filter through the narrow windows of his room when Marcus finally returned to his quarters. He sat heavily on his bed, his mind exhausted from the night's revelations, but his resolve strengthening with each passing moment. He had sworn an oath to protect the king, and that oath now demanded that he find a way to save Edmund's life while exposing the conspiracy that threatened to destroy everything the kingdom stood for. Marcus knew that he would need to be extremely careful in his next moves. Queen Helena and her conspirators were clearly intelligent and ruthless, and they would not hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened their plans. But somewhere in the castle, he was certain, there would be evidence of their crimes, the poison itself, records of their meetings, or correspondence that would reveal the full scope of their conspiracy. As he finally allowed himself to rest, Marcus made a silent vow that he would not let King Edmund die at the hands of the woman who shared his bed. The guard who had witnessed the queen's betrayal would become the instrument of the king's salvation, no matter what the cost to himself. The game of life and death that had begun with a simple cup of tea was far from over, and Marcus Stirling was determined to ensure that justice would ultimately prevail in the halls of Ravensholm Castle. Dawn brought no relief to Marcus Stirling's tormented mind. The pale morning light streaming through his chamber window seemed to mock the darkness of the secrets he now carried. As the castle slowly awakened around him, with servants beginning their daily routines and the smell of fresh bread wafting up from the kitchens, Marcus felt as though he was living in a completely different world from the innocent souls going about their morning duties. The guard had managed perhaps 2 hours of restless sleep, haunted by visions of Queen Helena's calculating eyes and the sound of poison droplets hitting Earl Grey tea. Now, as he dressed in his crisp uniform and prepared for another day of service, he knew that everything had changed. He was no longer simply a protector of the royal family. He had become a guardian of terrible knowledge that could either save a kingdom or destroy it. King Edmund appeared at breakfast looking haggard and pale, the effects of the previous night's poison still evident in his drawn features and slightly trembling hands. The royal family gathered in the ornate dining hall, a magnificent room adorned with tapestries depicting the heroic deeds of Edmund's ancestors. Crystal chandeliers cast sparkling light across the polished mahogany table, where golden plates and silver goblets awaited the morning meal. Prince Alexander, a bright boy with his father's kind eyes and his mother's dark hair, chatted excitedly about his upcoming riding lesson with the stable master. At 10 years old, he was beginning to show the qualities that would one day make him a fine king. Natural curiosity, genuine concern for others, and an infectious enthusiasm that brightened every room he entered. Princess Isabella, 2 years younger than her brother, was the image of her mother in miniature. Her violet eyes sparkled with intelligence as she described the new song she had learned from her music tutor. She possessed the same graceful bearing as Queen Helena, but there was an innocence in her manner that her mother had long since abandoned. Marcus watched from his position near the dining hall entrance as Helena fussed over her husband with apparent devotion. She insisted that he eat more of the porridge that had been specially prepared for his sensitive stomach, and she personally poured his morning tea from an elegant silver service. The guard found himself studying every gesture, every expression, looking for signs of the calculating murderess he had witnessed the night before. "You still look unwell, my darling," Helena said, her voice filled with what anyone else would have interpreted as loving concern. "Perhaps you should cancel your morning meetings and rest in bed today." King Edmund managed a weak smile as he reached across the table to squeeze his wife's hand. "I'm feeling better already, thanks to your excellent care. The kingdom cannot run itself, and Lord Pemberton is arriving this morning to discuss the new trade agreements with the eastern provinces." The Queen's violet eyes flickered with something that might have been annoyance, but the expression passed so quickly that Marcus wondered if he had imagined it. Helena had become accustomed to having her suggestions followed without question, and the king's determination to fulfill his duties despite his illness clearly frustrated her carefully laid plans. "At least promise me you'll take your afternoon tea in the garden pavilion," Helena pressed gently. "The fresh air will do you good, and I'll personally prepare your favorite blend." Marcus felt his stomach clench as he heard the Queen making arrangements for another opportunity to poison her husband. The casual way she discussed her murderous plans, disguised as wifely concern, made the guard's blood run cold. He had to force himself to maintain his professional composure, while every instinct screamed at him to throw himself between the king and his treacherous wife. After breakfast, Marcus made his way to the castle's ancient library, hoping to find some pretext for beginning his investigation into the conspiracy he had uncovered. The library was a magnificent repository of knowledge, with towering shelves of leather-bound volumes that reached from floor to ceiling. Ornate ladders provided access to the highest shelves, and comfortable reading chairs were scattered throughout the space, creating intimate alcoves where scholars could pursue their studies in peaceful solitude. The head librarian, Brother Thomas, was an elderly monk who had served the castle for more than 30 years. His wrinkled face bore the marks of a lifetime spent in scholarly pursuit, and his gentle manner had made him a favorite among both the royal family and the castle staff. Marcus had always respected the old monk's wisdom and discretion, qualities that he hoped might prove valuable in his current predicament. "Good morning, Brother Thomas," Marcus said, approaching the librarian's desk with what he hoped was a casual air. "I find myself with some free time this morning and thought I might do some reading. Do you have any books on the history of poisons used in royal courts?" The old monk's eyebrows rose slightly at the unusual request, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "An interesting subject for a guardsman to pursue," he observed mildly. "Might I ask what has sparked your curiosity about such a dark topic?"
Marcus had prepared for this question,
knowing that he would need a plausible explanation for his sudden interest in the subject. "I've been thinking about the security of the royal family," he replied carefully. "It occurred to me that I know very little about the methods that have been used throughout history to harm royalty. I thought such knowledge might help me better protect our king and queen." Brother Thomas nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with the explanation. "A prudent approach," he said, rising from his chair with the careful movements of age. "Knowledge of past threats can indeed help prevent future ones. Follow me." The monk led Marcus to a secluded section of the library where the most sensitive historical texts were kept. These books contain detailed accounts of assassinations, political conspiracies, and other dark chapters in royal history that were not suitable for general circulation. Brother Thomas selected a thick volume bound in midnight blue leather and handed it to the guard. "This text contains comprehensive information about poisoning attempts throughout European royal courts over the past 3 centuries, the monk explained in hushed tones. "You'll find detailed descriptions of various toxins, their symptoms, and the methods used to administer them. I trust you understand the sensitive nature of this material." Marcus assured the librarian of his discretion and found a quiet corner where he could examine the book without being observed. As he carefully turned the ancient pages, he was struck by the detailed accounts of royal poisonings that had occurred throughout history. The book described everything from quick-acting arsenic to slow-burning mercury poisoning, each entry accompanied by clinical descriptions of symptoms and timeframes. One particular section caught his attention, a chapter devoted to gradual poisoning for political advantage. The author described how certain ambitious individuals had used tiny doses of poison administered over extended periods to slowly weaken their targets while avoiding immediate suspicion. The symptoms described in the text matched perfectly with King Edmund's mysterious illness: periodic stomach pain, weakness, confusion, and gradual deterioration of health. The book also contained detailed information about various plant-based toxins that could be extracted and concentrated into nearly invisible liquids. Marcus read with growing horror about substances that were colorless, odorless, and tasteless when properly refined, making them ideal for secret administration in food or drink. The clear liquid he had seen Helena adding to the king's tea could have been any number of these deadly substances. As Marcus continued his research, he came across a particularly chilling passage about a case from the previous century in which a queen had slowly poisoned her husband over the course of 2 years. The historical account described how the woman had maintained the perfect facade of a devoted wife while gradually administering doses of a rare toxin extracted from certain flowering plants. The king in question had experienced exactly the same symptoms that were now plaguing Edmund, and he had died without anyone suspecting that his loving wife was responsible for his demise. The guard felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that Queen Helena's plan was not original. She was following a blueprint that had been used successfully by other royal murderers throughout history. The only difference was that Marcus had discovered her secret before it was too late to save the king. His reading was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Marcus quickly closed the book and looked up to see Sir Roderick Blackwood entering the library. The advisor's presence in the same place where Marcus was researching poison was an uncomfortable coincidence that made the guard's pulse quicken. Sir Roderick was a man in his 50s with steel-grey hair and penetrating blue eyes that seemed to see more than most people were comfortable revealing. He had served the crown with distinction for over 2 decades, and his political advice had helped King Edmund navigate some of the most challenging diplomatic crises of his reign. The idea that such a respected figure could be involved in a conspiracy against the king was almost too disturbing to contemplate. "Good morning, Marcus," Sir Roderick said with his usual cordial manner. "I don't often see guardsmen in the library. Expanding your education, are you?" Marcus felt the weight of the advisor's gaze and struggled to maintain his composure. "I'm reading about castle security, Sir Roderick. Brother Thomas recommended some historical text that might help me better understand potential threats to the royal family." The advisor's expression remained pleasant, but Marcus noticed a slight tightening around his eyes that suggested increased interest. "How commendable," Sir Roderick said smoothly. "One can never be too careful when it comes to protecting those we serve. I trust you're finding the material enlightening?" The exchange felt loaded with hidden meaning, and Marcus wondered if Sir Roderick suspected that his nighttime meeting with the Queen had been observed. The guard decided that discretion was the better part of valor and excused himself from the library, but not before he noticed the advisor moving toward the same section where the poisoning texts were kept. Marcus spent the rest of the morning struggling to maintain his normal duties while his mind raced with plans for gathering more evidence against the conspirators. He needed proof that would be convincing enough to present to the kingdom's authorities, but he also had to be careful not to tip his hand to Helena and her allies. If they suspected that their plot had been discovered, they might accelerate their timeline or eliminate potential witnesses. The afternoon brought the dreaded tea service that Queen Helena had arranged with her husband during breakfast. Marcus positioned himself in the garden where he could observe the pavilion while appearing to patrol the castle grounds. The pavilion was an elegant structure with white columns and flowering vines, designed as a peaceful retreat where the royal family could enjoy the fresh air and beautiful views of the castle gardens. King Edmund arrived at the appointed time, looking marginally better after his morning meetings, but still showing signs of the ongoing effects of his wife's poisoning campaign. He settled into one of the comfortable chairs in the pavilion and began reviewing documents that his secretary had prepared for his afternoon correspondence. Queen Helena appeared shortly afterward, carrying the familiar silver tray with its deadly cargo. Marcus watched in fascination and horror as she performed the same ritual he had witnessed the previous evening. The gracious smile, the tender words of concern, and the careful presentation of the poisoned tea. The king accepted the beverage with obvious pleasure, completely unaware that his beloved wife was systematically destroying his health. This time, however, Marcus was prepared. He had borrowed a small telescope from the castle's observatory, and from his concealed position behind a large oak tree, he was able to observe the Queen's actions in much greater detail. He watched as Helena once again encouraged her husband to drink the entire cup of tea, engaging him in pleasant conversation while monitoring his consumption of the poison. The guard made careful mental notes of everything he observed: the time of day, the amount of tea consumed, and the progression of symptoms that began to manifest within minutes of the king finishing his drink. Edmund's face grew pale, his hand pressed against his stomach, and he began to show signs of the weakness that had become such a troubling pattern in his life. Marcus also noticed something else that had escaped his attention the night before. Queen Helena was keeping what appeared to be careful notes in a small leather journal, making brief entries with a silver pen that she kept hidden in the folds of her dress. The guard realized that she was documenting the effects of her poisoning campaign, probably to ensure that she was administering the correct dosage to achieve her desired timeline for her husband's demise. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus formulated a plan that would allow him to gather the concrete evidence he needed to expose the conspiracy. He would need to gain access to Helena's private chambers to find the poison and the journal, but he would also need to time his investigation carefully to avoid detection. The Queen maintained a predictable schedule of activities that might provide him with the opportunity he needed. The evening brought another challenge, as Marcus realized that he could not simply stand by and watch the king consume another dose of poison during his nightly tea ritual. His oath as a guard demanded that he protect Edmund from harm, even if doing so might compromise his investigation. The guard began to consider ways that he might intervene without revealing his knowledge of the conspiracy. As the castle prepared for the night, Marcus noticed increased activity among certain members of the staff who had previously seemed above suspicion. Sir Roderick was holding quiet conferences with various courtiers, and there seemed to be an undercurrent of excitement among Helena's personal servants. The guard began to suspect that the conspiracy extended far beyond the Queen and her primary advisor. The complexity of the plot was becoming clear, and Marcus realized that he was dealing with a carefully orchestrated coup that had probably been in planning for months or even years. Helena's gradual poisoning of the king was just one element of a larger scheme that would culminate in her assuming control of the kingdom through her son's minority. As darkness fell over Ravensholm Castle, Marcus prepared for another night of investigation and surveillance. He had learned much during his first day of active investigation, but he knew the time was running out for King Edmund. Each cup of poisoned tea brought the monarch closer to death, and each day that passed gave the conspirators more time to solidify their plans. The guard checked his weapons and made sure that his movements through the castle would not be easily detected. Tonight, he would take the dangerous step of searching Queen Helena's private chambers for the evidence he needed to save the king's life. He knew that if he was discovered, his own life would likely be forfeit, but his oath of loyalty to the crown left him no choice. Marcus looked out the window of his chamber at the star-filled sky above the castle and said a silent prayer for strength and guidance. Tomorrow would bring either salvation for the kingdom or disaster for everyone involved. The loyal guard who had stumbled upon a royal conspiracy was about to become an active participant in a deadly game where the stakes were nothing less than the future of an entire realm. The castle's ancient stones had witnessed many dramatic moments throughout their long history, but none quite as significant as the events that were about to unfold in the shadowed corridors of Ravensholm. The battle for King Edmund's life, and for the soul of the kingdom itself, was about to begin in earnest. The midnight hour struck as Marcus Stirling crept through the darkened corridors of Ravensholm Castle, his heart pounding with the dangerous mission that lay ahead. Every shadow seemed to hide potential discovery. Every creaking floorboard threatened to announce his unauthorized presence in the most forbidden areas of the royal residence. The guard had spent years learning the castle's layout during his loyal service, but tonight those familiar passages felt like a treacherous maze leading toward either salvation or doom. Queen Helena's private chambers occupied the castle's most luxurious wing, a suite of interconnected rooms that reflected both her royal status and her refined taste for beautiful things. The apartment was accessible through a main entrance that was constantly guarded, but Marcus knew of a secondary door that connected to the Queen's private study through the castle's old servant passages. These hidden corridors had been built centuries earlier to allow staff to move unseen through the castle, and they now provided the perfect route for his clandestine investigation. The narrow passage was cramped and musty, filled with the accumulated dust and cobwebs of decades. Marcus moved carefully, using only the faint light of a shielded candle to guide his way. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of wind whistling through the castle's ancient stones and the occasional scurrying of mice in the walls. Every step brought him closer to either the evidence that would save King Edmund's life or the discovery that would likely cost him his own. Marcus reached the concealed door that led to Helena's study and pressed his ear against the worn wood, listening for any sign of movement within the room. The Queen typically retired to a bedchamber by 11 o'clock, but he could not afford to assume that she was following her normal routine on this particular night. After several minutes of careful listening revealed only silence, he slowly worked the latch and eased the door open just enough to peer into the study. The room was elegantly appointed, with rich tapestries, polished furniture, and shelves lined with leather-bound books that reflected Helena's education and sophistication. Moonlight streamed through tall windows, casting ethereal patterns across the Persian carpet and creating an almost otherworldly atmosphere. Marcus slipped into the room and began his methodical search, starting with the ornate wooden box he had seen the Queen use to store her poison. The box sat on Helena's writing desk, positioned among other personal items in a way that suggested it held no more significance than a jewelry case or collection of cosmetics. But as Marcus carefully lifted the lid, he found himself staring at an array of small glass vials, containing various liquids, powders, and crystalline substances. Each vial was meticulously labeled in Helena's elegant handwriting, with names that meant nothing to Marcus but which he carefully memorized for future reference. The clear liquid that he had seen Helena add to the king's tea was contained in a vial marked simply as extract of nightshade, concentrated. Even someone with Marcus's limited knowledge of toxicology knew that nightshade was a deadly poison, and the fact that Helena possessed a concentrated extract of the substance left no doubt about her murderous intentions. The guard carefully examined the other vials and found substances derived from oleander, foxglove, and other plants known for their lethal properties. At the bottom of the box, Marcus discovered what appeared to be a detailed chart showing dosages and timing schedules. The document was written in Helena's precise handwriting and contained calculations that would allow her to administer poison in carefully measured amounts over extended periods. The chart showed a gradual escalation of dosages designed to slowly weaken the victim while avoiding the sudden onset of symptoms that might raise immediate suspicions. Marcus felt his blood run cold as he realized the scientific precision with which Helena had planned her husband's murder. This was not a crime of passion or momentary madness. It was a calculated campaign of assassination that had been planned with the thoroughness of a military operation. The Queen had studied her deadly craft with the same attention to detail that others might apply to music or literature. The guard's search of the desk revealed additional horrors. Hidden in a locked drawer that he managed to open with a small knife, Marcus found Helena's personal journal, bound in soft leather and filled with months of detailed observations about the king's declining health. The entries read like a physician's notes, documenting symptoms, timing of doses, and the gradual progression of Edmund's mysterious illness. One particularly chilling entry, dated just 2 weeks earlier, read, E showing increased sensitivity to the nightshade extract, reducing dosage by half to extend timeline and avoid arousing Dr. Whitmore's suspicions. Current schedule should achieve desired results within 6 to 8 weeks. R confirms that all political arrangements are in place for the transition. The reference to R clearly indicated Sir Roderick Blackwood, confirming Marcus's suspicion that the advisor was deeply involved in the conspiracy. But more disturbing was the casual, almost clinical way in which Helena discussed her husband's murder, as if she were planning a garden party rather than the death of the man who loved and trusted her completely. Marcus continued reading through the journal entries, each page revealing new depths of betrayal and calculation. Helena had been documenting not only the physical effects of her poisoning campaign, but also the political ramifications of Edmund's eventual death. The entries revealed that she had been secretly negotiating with various noble houses to ensure their support for her regency, using a combination of promises, threats, and blackmail to secure their loyalty. The journal also contained detailed plans for the period following Edmund's death. Helena had already arranged for key military commanders to be replaced with officers loyal to her cause, and she had prepared explanations for Edmund's demise that would deflect any suspicions of foul play. The king would appear to have died from a wasting disease that had gradually weakened his constitution, a tragic but natural end that would generate sympathy for his grieving widow and young son. As Marcus read through the conspiracy's intricate details, he began to understand the full scope of Helena's ambitions. She was not simply planning to murder her husband. She was orchestrating a complete transformation of the kingdom's power structure that would leave her as the ultimate authority behind her son's throne. The carefully planned assassination was just the first step in a larger scheme that would fundamentally alter the nature of Valdoria's government. The guard's investigation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside the study. Marcus quickly extinguished his candle and pressed himself against the wall beside the window, using the heavy curtains to conceal his presence. The footsteps paused outside the door, and he held his breath as someone tested the handle to ensure that the room was properly secured. After what seemed like an eternity, the footsteps continued down the corridor and faded into silence. Marcus waited several more minutes before relighting his candle and continuing his search. He photographed several pages of the journal using a small camera he had borrowed from the castle's photographer, hoping that the images would provide sufficient evidence to expose the conspiracy when the time came to act. The final element of Marcus's search focused on Helena's correspondence, which was stored in an ornate secretary desk that dominated one corner of the study. The letters he discovered revealed the international scope of the conspiracy, with Helena receiving support and encouragement from various foreign courts that would benefit from instability in Valdoria. One letter, bearing the seal of a neighboring kingdom, explicitly promised military support for Helena's regency in exchange for favorable trade agreements and territorial concessions. Another correspondence revealed that Helena had been secretly negotiating to arrange marriages for her children that would strengthen her political position while potentially weakening Valdoria's traditional alliances. Marcus realized that he was uncovering not just a murder plot, but a comprehensive plan for the betrayal of an entire kingdom. Helena was willing to sacrifice not only her husband's life but also her nation's sovereignty to achieve her personal ambitions. The scope of her treachery was almost beyond comprehension. The guard's most disturbing discovery came in the form of a letter written in Helena's own hand but never sent. The document was addressed to a foreign dignitary and contained detailed information about Valdoria's military defenses, strategic resources, and potential vulnerabilities. Helena was apparently prepared to provide sensitive intelligence to enemy nations in exchange for their support of her illegitimate claim to power. As Marcus carefully returned the letters to their original positions, he heard the sound of voices coming from the corridor outside. This time, the conversation was close enough for him to make out individual words, and he recognized Helena's distinctive accent among the speakers. The Queen had returned to her chambers earlier than expected, accompanied by what sounded like at least 2 other individuals. The guard found himself trapped in the study with no immediate means of escape. The hidden passage through which he had entered was on the opposite side of the room from his current position, and reaching it would require crossing directly in front of the windows where he might be silhouetted against the moonlight. Marcus pressed himself deeper into the shadows and listened as the conversation in the corridor continued. The timeline must be accelerated. Helena's voice was tense with urgency. Marcus Sterling has been asking suspicious questions, and I believe he may have witnessed more than he should have. We cannot risk discovery when we are so close to success. Sir Roderick's response was calm but equally concerned. What do you propose? If we increase the dosage too dramatically, it will certainly arouse Dr. Whitmore's suspicions. The physician may be easily fooled, but he is not completely incompetent. A third voice, which Marcus did not immediately recognize, suggested a more direct approach. Perhaps it is time to consider alternatives to the gradual poisoning. An accident during the King's morning ride or a hunting mishap might accomplish our goals more quickly and with less risk of discovery. Helena's response revealed the calculating nature of her character. Edmund's death must appear natural to avoid any suggestion of foul play. Too many people have noticed his declining health for us to suddenly change the apparent cause of his demise. We will continue with the current plan but increase the frequency of doses. I will begin adding the extract to his morning tea, as well as his evening service. Marcus felt sick as he listened to the casual discussion of accelerating the King's murder. These conspirators were talking about Edmund's life as if it were nothing more than an inconvenience to be eliminated, showing no regard for the man himself or for the chaos that his death would bring to the kingdom. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with the participants discussing various aspects of their plot and making adjustments to their plans based on recent developments. Marcus learned that they had spies throughout the castle who were monitoring the activities of potentially suspicious individuals, and that they had prepared contingency plans for dealing with anyone who might threaten their scheme. Most alarmingly, Marcus discovered that his own activities had not gone unnoticed. Helena mentioned that several servants had reported unusual behavior from certain guards, including unauthorized presence in sensitive areas of the castle and suspicious questions about royal security procedures. The conspirators were aware that someone might be investigating their activities, even if they had not yet identified Marcus as the specific threat. As the meeting in the corridor finally broke up, Marcus realized that his position had become extremely dangerous. The conspirators knew that they were under some form of surveillance, and they would undoubtedly increase their vigilance in the coming days. His window of opportunity for gathering evidence and exposing the plot was rapidly closing. The guard waited until he was certain that Helena and her associates had departed before attempting to make his escape through the hidden passage. As he carefully made his way back through the cramped corridor, his mind raced with the implications of everything he had discovered. The conspiracy was far more extensive than he had initially imagined, involving not only Helena and Sir Roderick, but also foreign powers and numerous individuals within the castle itself. Marcus now possessed concrete evidence of the plot against King Edmund, but he faced the challenge of deciding how to use that evidence effectively. If he presented his findings to the wrong person, he might inadvertently alert the conspirators to his discovery and give them the opportunity to eliminate him before he could save the king. He needed to identify individuals within the castle who could be trusted completely, people whose loyalty to Edmund was beyond question. As he finally reached the safety of his own quarters, Marcus reflected on the terrible burden of knowledge that he now carried. The next few days would determine not only King Edmund's fate, but also the future of the entire kingdom of Valdoria. The loyal guard who had stumbled upon a royal conspiracy was about to become the key figure in a deadly game where the stakes could not be higher. The evidence he had gathered was damning, but Marcus knew that exposing the conspiracy would require careful planning and impeccable timing. He had to save the king's life while simultaneously preventing the broader plot from succeeding, all while avoiding the detection of enemies who were already suspicious of his activities. The margin for error was virtually non-existent, and the consequences of failure would be catastrophic. Marcus spent the remainder of the night carefully documenting everything he had learned, creating a detailed record that would serve as insurance in case something happened to him before he could complete his mission. As dawn approached, he prepared for what he knew would be the most dangerous and important day of his life. The battle for King Edmund's survival, and for the preservation of the kingdom itself, was about to enter its most critical phase. The morning of reckoning dawned grey and forbidding over Ravensholm Castle, as if the very heavens sensed the deadly drama that was about to unfold within its ancient walls. Marcus Sterling had not slept since returning from his dangerous mission in Queen Helena's chambers, his mind consumed with plans for exposing the conspiracy, while keeping King Edmund alive long enough to see justice done. The weight of the evidence he had gathered felt heavier than his sword and armor combined, and he knew that the next few hours would determine the fate of everyone he had sworn to protect. The castle's morning routines proceeded with deceptive normalcy, servants bustling through corridors with breakfast trays, courtiers preparing for their daily audiences with the king, and guards changing shifts with the precision that had marked their service for generations. But beneath this veneer of ordinary castle life, Marcus could sense the undercurrents of tension that suggested the conspiracy was indeed accelerating its timeline, as Helena had indicated during her midnight meeting. King Edmund appeared for breakfast looking worse than Marcus had ever seen him, the cumulative effects of months of poisoning finally beginning to take a visible toll on his once robust constitution. The monarch's hands trembled slightly as he lifted his cup. His face bore an unhealthy pallor that cosmetics could not disguise, and his movements lacked the confident energy that had always characterized his bearing. Marcus realized with growing alarm that they were running out of time. The king's body was beginning to succumb to the systematic assault that had been waged against it. Queen Helena played her role of concerned wife with the skill of an accomplished actress, fussing over Edmund's lack of appetite and expressing worry about his continued deterioration. She announced that she had prepared a special tonic to help restore his strength, a concoction that would be served with his morning tea to provide additional nourishment and medicinal benefits. Marcus felt his blood run cold as he realized that the queen was implementing her accelerated poisoning schedule exactly as she had described to her co-conspirators.
"My darling, you simply must try this new preparation,"
Helena cooed, her voice sweet with false concern. Brother Ambrose in the monastery suggested this particular combination of herbs to help restore your vitality. I've spent hours preparing it specially for you. The mention of Brother Ambrose troubled Marcus deeply, as the elderly monk was renowned throughout the kingdom for his knowledge of herbal medicine and his unwavering loyalty to the crown. If Helena was using the respected monk's name to lend credibility to her poisonous concoctions, it suggested that she was becoming increasingly desperate and reckless in her methods. King Edmund accepted his wife's ministrations with the trusting gratitude of a man who had never doubted her devotion, completely unaware that each sip of her medicinal tonic was bringing him closer to death. The scene was almost unbearable for Marcus to witness, knowing as he did the true nature of Helena's care and the calculated malice that lay behind her loving gestures. After breakfast, Marcus knew he had to act swiftly to prevent the queen from administering additional doses of poison throughout the day. His investigation the previous night had provided him with the evidence needed to expose the conspiracy, But he still faced the challenge of finding trustworthy allies who could help him confront such powerful enemies. The network of conspirators extended too deeply into the castle's hierarchy for him to simply approach random courtiers or guards with his accusations. The guards' first priority was to identify individuals whose loyalty to King Edmund was absolute and whose integrity was beyond question. After careful consideration, Marcus decided to approach Captain William Hartwell, the commander of the Royal Guard and a man whose devotion to the crown had been proven through decades of faithful service. Captain Hartwell was also one of the few people in the castle who possessed the authority and credibility needed to take immediate action against the conspirators. Marcus found Captain Hartwell in the guard's training yard, observing the morning weapons practice with his characteristic attention to detail. At 52, Hartwell was still an imposing figure despite the grey that had begun to streak his brown hair, and his keen blue eyes seemed to miss nothing that occurred within his domain. He had served King Edmund's father before ascending to his current position, and his loyalty to the royal family was legendary throughout the kingdom.
"Captain Hartwell," Marcus began carefully, "I need to speak with you privately about a matter of extreme urgency concerning the king's safety." The captain's expression immediately became serious as he recognized the gravity in Marcus's tone.
Without hesitation, he dismissed the training session and led Marcus to his private office, a Spartanly furnished room that reflected its occupants' no-nonsense approach to his duties. "What have you discovered, Sterling?" Hartwell asked, his weathered features showing the concern of a man who had dedicated his life to protecting the royal family. Marcus took a deep breath and began to relate everything he had witnessed and learned over the past several days. He described watching Queen Helena poison the king's tea, following her to the midnight meeting in the wine cellar, and discovering the extensive evidence of the conspiracy in her private chambers. Throughout his account, Captain Hartwell's expression grew increasingly grim, the implications of Marcus's discoveries clearly weighing heavily on the veteran soldier's mind. When Marcus finished his report, Captain Hartwell sat in silence for several long moments, processing the enormity of what he had heard. The captain's face reflected the same struggle that Marcus had experienced upon first learning of the conspiracy. The difficulty of accepting that someone so trusted and beloved could be capable of such monstrous betrayal. "The evidence you describe would certainly be sufficient for a formal investigation," Captain Hartwell said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision he was being asked to make. "But we must proceed with extreme caution. If Queen Helena and her conspirators suspect that we know of their plot, they might take desperate action that could endanger not only the king but his children as well." Marcus had anticipated this concern and had already begun formulating a plan that would allow them to gather additional evidence while simultaneously protecting the royal family. "I propose that we arrange for Dr. Whitmore to conduct a thorough examination of the king's condition," he suggested. "If the physician can identify traces of poison in His Majesty's system, it will provide independent confirmation of our suspicions." Captain Hartwell nodded thoughtfully. "Dr. Whitmore's integrity is beyond question, and his medical expertise would certainly be valuable in documenting the nature of the king's illness. But we must also consider how to prevent further poisoning attempts while our investigation proceeds." The two men spent the next hour developing a comprehensive strategy for exposing the conspiracy while protecting King Edmund from additional harm. They agreed that Marcus would continue to monitor Queen Helena's activities while Captain Hartwell quietly gathered trusted allies who could help them when the time came to make arrests. They would need to move swiftly once their investigation was complete, as any delay might give the conspirators the opportunity to complete their murderous plans or escape to foreign territories where they would be beyond the reach of Valdorian justice. Their planning was interrupted by the arrival of a young page, who brought urgent news that sent chills through both men. King Edmund had collapsed during his morning audience with Lord Pemberton and had been carried unconscious to his chambers. Dr. Whitmore had been summoned immediately, and Queen Helena was reportedly distraught with worry about her husband's sudden deterioration. Marcus and Captain Hartwell exchanged meaningful glances, both recognizing that Helena's accelerated poisoning schedule was already beginning to show its deadly effects. They hurried to the royal chambers, where they found the castle in a state of controlled chaos as servants and courtiers struggled to cope with the crisis of their monarch's sudden collapse. Dr. Whitmore emerged from the king's bedchamber looking deeply troubled, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of the strain he felt at his inability to diagnose and treat Edmund's mysterious condition. The physician was a man in his 60s whose dedication to his profession had earned him respect throughout the medical community, and his obvious concern about the king's health added credibility to the severity of the situation. "His Majesty's condition has deteriorated significantly, Dr. Poss,"
Whitmore reported to the assembled courtiers. I'm observing symptoms that suggest some form of systemic poisoning, but I cannot identify the specific agent responsible without conducting more detailed tests. Queen Helena's reaction to the physician's preliminary diagnosis was a masterful display of shocked innocence and devastating grief. She gasped audibly at the mention of poisoning, pressed her hand to her heart as if physically wounded by the suggestion, and immediately demanded to know who could have perpetrated such a heinous act against her beloved husband.
Poisoning? Helena exclaimed, her voice breaking with apparent emotion. But how is such a thing possible? Who had access to my husband's food and drink? Who could have done this terrible thing? Marcus watched the Queen's performance with a mixture of admiration and disgust, marveling at her ability to convincingly portray the very emotions that a truly innocent wife would feel upon learning of such an attack. Helena's acting skills were so refined that even knowing the truth about her guilt, Marcus found himself momentarily questioning his own perceptions. Sir Roderick Blackwood appeared at Helena's side with remarkable promptness, offering comfort and support to the supposedly devastated Queen, while simultaneously beginning to discuss the political implications of the King's condition. The advisor's quick transition from personal sympathy to governmental concerns struck Marcus as suspicious, particularly given his knowledge of Roderick's involvement in the conspiracy. If His Majesty has indeed been poisoned, Sir Roderick said gravely, we must immediately begin an investigation to identify the perpetrator and ensure that there are no additional threats to the royal family. We must also consider the need for increased security measures and perhaps the temporary assumption of certain royal duties by Queen Helena until the king recovers. Marcus realized that the conspirators were already beginning to implement their plans for seizing power under the pretext of protecting the kingdom during the crisis. Helena's expression of devastated grief was perfectly calculated to generate sympathy and support for her assumption of greater authority, while Sir Roderick's focus on governmental continuity provided the political justification for the power transfer they had been planning all along. Captain Hartwell stepped forward with the calm authority that had served him throughout his military career. Dr. Whitmore, what additional tests would be required to identify the specific type of poison and its source? The physician considered the question carefully before responding.
I would need to examine samples of everything His Majesty has consumed over the past several days, including food, beverages, and any medications or tonics. I would also need to conduct more detailed blood tests to identify traces of foreign substances in his system. Queen Helena immediately volunteered to provide access to anything that might help the investigation, offering to personally oversee the collection of samples from the king's meals and beverages. Her eagerness to cooperate was another brilliant tactical move that would help deflect suspicion while potentially allowing her to contaminate or destroy evidence that might implicate her. Marcus exchanged a meaningful look with Captain Hartwell, both men recognizing that they could not allow Helena to control the evidence-gathering process. The captain stepped forward with a suggestion that would help protect the integrity of their investigation. Perhaps it would be more appropriate for the guard to secure and catalogue all potential evidence, Captain Hartwell suggested diplomatically. This would ensure that proper chain of custody procedures are followed and that no one can later question the validity of Dr. Whitmore's findings. The suggestion was perfectly reasonable from a security standpoint, but Marcus could see a flash of annoyance in Helena's eyes before she quickly masked it with an expression of grateful acceptance. The Queen was clearly frustrated at losing control over the evidence, but she could not object to the captain's proposal without raising suspicions about her motives. As the various officials dispersed to begin their respective aspects of the investigation, Marcus found himself alone for a brief moment with Dr. Whitmore. The physician had always struck him as a man of exceptional integrity and intelligence, qualities that made him an ideal ally in the effort to expose the conspiracy. "Doctor," Marcus said quietly, "I have reason to believe that the king's poisoning may have been ongoing for several months. If I could provide you with information about the specific type of poison being used and its likely administration schedule, would that help guide your investigation?" Dr. Whitmore's eyes sharpened with professional interest and concern. "Any information that could help me identify the toxin and its effects would be invaluable," he replied. "The king's life may depend on our ability to quickly determine the appropriate treatment." Marcus briefly described what he had learned about Helena's use of concentrated nightshade extract and her systematic approach to administering the poison. Whitmore's expression grew increasingly grave as he absorbed the implications of this information, and Marcus could see the physician beginning to piece together the pattern of symptoms that had been puzzling him for months. "If your information is accurate, Dr. Whitmore said grimly, "then His Majesty has been the victim of a particularly sophisticated and malicious poisoning campaign. The gradual administration of nightshade extract would explain many of the symptoms I've observed,
and it suggests that whoever is responsible possesses considerable knowledge of toxicology. The physician's confirmation of Marcus's suspicions provided additional validation for the guards' investigation, but it also highlighted the urgency of their situation. If King Edmund had been systematically poisoned for months with increasing doses, his body might have already sustained irreversible damage that could prove fatal even if the poisoning were immediately stopped. As the day progressed, Marcus continued his surveillance of Queen Helena and her associates, noting their reactions to the investigation, and watching for any signs that they were preparing to flee or take other desperate measures. The Queen maintained her performance of grief-stricken innocence with remarkable consistency, but Marcus occasionally caught glimpses of calculation in her eyes that revealed her true nature to anyone who knew what to look for. The most dangerous moment came when Marcus overheard a brief conversation between Helena and Sir Roderick in a secluded alcove of the castle. The advisor was expressing concern about the thoroughness of Dr. Whitmore's investigation and questioning whether they should consider more drastic measures to protect their interests. "The physician is more competent than we anticipated," Sir Roderick murmured urgently. "If he succeeds in identifying the specific poison and its source, it could lead to uncomfortable questions about access and opportunity." Helena's response revealed the steel that lay beneath her gentle exterior. "Dr. Whitmore will find exactly what we allow him to find," she said coldly. "I have already made arrangements to ensure that his investigation leads to the appropriate conclusions." Marcus realized with growing alarm that the conspirators were planning to manipulate Dr. Whitmore's investigation to frame an innocent party for the king's poisoning. This would not only allow Helena to escape justice, but would also enable her to consolidate her power by eliminating potential rivals who might threaten her control over the kingdom. The guard knew that time was running out for both King Edmund and for the kingdom itself. Helena and her allies were moving to complete their takeover under cover of the crisis they had created, and any delay in exposing their crimes might allow them to succeed in their treacherous plans. Marcus had gathered the evidence needed to prove their guilt, but now he faced the challenge of revealing that evidence in a way that would ensure justice rather than simply alerting the conspirators to his knowledge of their crimes. As evening approached and the castle settled into an uneasy quiet, Marcus prepared for what he knew would be the final confrontation with the forces that threatened everything he had sworn to protect. The loyal guard who had discovered a royal conspiracy was about to become the instrument of either salvation or destruction for the kingdom of Valdoria. The final act of the conspiracy began to unfold as twilight descended upon Ravensholm Castle, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the darkness that had invaded the very heart of the kingdom. King Edmund lay unconscious in his royal chamber, his breathing shallow and labored as the accumulated poison continued its deadly work within his system. Dr. Whitmore worked tirelessly at his bedside, administering treatments designed to counteract the effects of the nightshade extract, but the physician's grave expression revealed his uncertainty about whether they had discovered the truth in time to save the monarch's life. Marcus Sterling had reached the moment of ultimate decision. All the evidence he had gathered, all the surveillance he had conducted, and all the planning he had done with Captain Hartwell had brought them to this crucial point where action could no longer be delayed. The guard knew that Queen Helena and her conspirators would not wait much longer to implement their final plans, and any hesitation on his part might doom not only King Edmund, but the entire kingdom to the rule of murderers and traitors. Captain Hartwell had spent the day quietly assembling a force of guards whose loyalty to the crown was absolute, and whose discretion could be trusted completely. These men had been carefully selected for their courage, their integrity, and their ability to act decisively when the moment of truth arrived. Each guard had been briefed on the essential details of the conspiracy without revealing more than was necessary for them to understand their role in the coming confrontation. The captain's strategy was elegantly simple, yet devastatingly effective. Rather than attempting to arrest Queen Helena and her allies simultaneously, which might give some conspirators the opportunity to escape or destroy evidence, they would spring their trap during the evening meal when all the primary conspirators would be gathered together in the Great Hall. This approach would allow them to capture the entire leadership of the conspiracy while minimizing the risk to innocent members of the court who might be caught in the crossfire. As the castle's inhabitants prepared for what they expected to be another routine evening meal, Marcus made his final preparations for the confrontation that would determine the future of Valdoria. He checked his weapons, reviewed the evidence one last time, and said a silent prayer for the strength and wisdom needed to see justice done. The loyal guard who had stumbled upon a royal conspiracy was about to become the instrument of either salvation or destruction for everything he held dear. Queen Helena appeared in the Great Hall dressed in elegant black silk that was ostensibly chosen to reflect her grief over her husband's condition. but which Marcus now recognized as premature mourning attire. She moved through the assembled courtiers with the grace and dignity of a grieving queen, accepting condolences and expressions of support while skillfully positioning herself as the natural leader during the kingdom's time of crisis. Sir Roderick Blackwood accompanied the Queen, serving as her chief advisor and spokesman as they began to discuss the governmental arrangements that would be necessary if King Edmund did not recover from his mysterious illness. The advisor's smooth political instincts were on full display as he suggested various measures that would transfer power to Helena while maintaining the appearance of temporary arrangements made necessary by the emergency. The other conspirators were also present, scattered throughout the hall but maintaining subtle communication through meaningful glances and carefully coded conversations. Marcus recognized several faces from his surveillance activities, including minor nobles who had apparently been recruited to support Helena's cause, and castle staff members who had been compromised through bribery or blackmail. Dr. Whitmore entered the Great Hall looking exhausted and deeply troubled by his inability to reverse the king's declining condition. The physician's presence provided Marcus with the perfect opportunity to reveal the evidence that would expose the conspiracy, as the doctor's respected voice would lend credibility to accusations that might otherwise be dismissed as the paranoid fantasies of an overzealous guard. Captain Hartwell gave Marcus a subtle nod, indicating that all of their loyal guards were in position and ready to act on his signal. The moment of truth had arrived, and there could be no turning back from the confrontation that would either save the kingdom or destroy everyone involved in attempting to expose the conspiracy. Marcus stepped forward into the center of the Great Hall, his voice carrying clearly through the ornate chamber as he addressed the assembled court. "My lords and ladies," he began, his tone commanding attention despite his relatively modest rank, "I have discovered evidence of a treasonous conspiracy against His Majesty King Edmund, and I call upon Dr. Whitmore to confirm the nature of the attack that has been made against our sovereign." The reaction in the hall was immediate and dramatic. Gasps of shock and disbelief echoed from the walls as courtiers struggled to comprehend the implications of Marcus's accusation. Queen Helena's face went deathly pale before quickly assuming an expression of outraged indignation, while Sir Roderick stepped protectively to her side with the smooth reflexes of a man accustomed to political crises. "How dare you make such accusations without evidence?" Helena declared, her voice shaking with what appeared to be righteous anger. "My husband lies dying, and you choose this moment to spread vicious rumors and conspiracy theories. Guards, arrest this man for treason and sedition." But Captain Hartwell's loyal guards remained in their positions, their hands resting on their weapons as they waited for their commander's orders, rather than responding to the Queen's demands. The subtle shift in the room's power dynamics was immediately apparent to everyone present, and Marcus could see fear beginning to replace anger in Helena's violet eyes. Dr. Whitmore stepped forward with the authority of his medical expertise and his reputation for uncompromising honesty. "I have examined His Majesty thoroughly," the physician announced, "and I can confirm that he is indeed suffering from systematic poisoning. The toxin appears to be a concentrated extract of nightshade, administered in small doses over an extended period of time." The doctor's clinical confirmation of the poisoning sent shockwaves through the assembled court, but Marcus was not finished with his revelations. He produced the photographs he had taken of Helena's journal and poison collection, passing them to Dr. Whitmore for examination and verification. "These images document Queen Helena's detailed plans for her husband's murder," Marcus continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the accusations he was making. "Her private journal contains months of observations about the king's symptoms, calculations of dosages, and records of the poison's effects. She has been systematically murdering her husband while maintaining the pretense of devoted care."
"Doctor!"
Whitmore examined the photographs with growing horror, his professional knowledge allowing him to immediately recognize the significance of what he was seeing. "These documents show a sophisticated understanding of toxicology and a systematic approach to poisoning that explains every symptom I have observed in His Majesty," the physician confirmed. "This evidence is entirely consistent with my medical findings." Queen Helena's composure finally cracked under the weight of the evidence against her. The mask of innocent grief fell away to reveal the calculating murderess that Marcus had discovered, her violet eyes now blazing with fury and desperation as she realized that her carefully laid plans were collapsing around her. "You have no idea what you are interfering with," Helena snarled, her refined accent becoming harsh and guttural as her true nature emerged. "Edmund is a weak ruler who has led this kingdom toward disaster.